Does Jesus pay his taxes? Well, the answer is a little bit fishy. Hi, I'm David Servant. This is HeavenWord TV. Well, happy day once again. It's great to be together as we're continuing, as you know, our chronological study through the entire New Testament. I say that every time simply because some people will find individual segments on the web and they don't know that that's what we're doing, and hopefully they will decide to join us in this journey. Today we're in Matthew chapter 17, getting close to the end here, beginning in verse number 22. To keep in context, Jesus has just come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, where Peter, James, and John saw Moses and Elijah for the first time in hundreds of years, and then Jesus delivered a demonized boy who was having these terrible epileptic seizures. And so we begin reading in Matthew 17. I just want to read a couple of verses here. While they were gathering together, this is verse 22, while they were gathering together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And then the last little sentence there in verse number 23 is, "And they were deeply grieved." Well, at least according to Matthew's gospel, this is the second time in a very brief amount of time that Jesus has brought this subject up. He's trying to prepare his disciples for something that, is shocking to their ears to hear about it, and it's going to be tough to go through. And he knows that, so he wants to prepare them as best he can. He already did this in Matthew chapter 16. Now, I like to take a look at the other gospel accounts to see if we can get a little more insight as to what he said and what was their reaction. Of course, the transfiguration and the casting out of this demonized boy in all the synoptic gospels. So if we go to Mark chapter 9 and verse number 31, look for another little detail here. For he was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later." Now, Matthew told us they were deeply grieved at this statement, but look what Mark says in verse number 32 of chapter 9. "But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him." So isn't that interesting? You put them all together. They're both true. They were deeply grieved, but they didn't understand, and they were afraid to ask him. And then comparing the third synoptic gospel, Luke, also chapter 9, verse 44, read this one with me. Jesus said, "Let these words sink into your ears, for the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." Verse number 45. "But they did not understand this statement, and it was concealed from them so that they would not perceive it." And so you get even more revelation as to what was going on here. They were deeply grieved. They didn't understand it. They were afraid to ask him. And it seems, Luke certainly seems to imply that God was willing that they not understand it at that point in time. It was concealed from them so that they would not perceive it. And then he adds at the end of verse 45, "And they were afraid to ask him about this statement." Okay, so agreeing completely with what Mark had reported on that. So you can see how cool it is to look at all three of the synoptic writers and compare them and get just a little bit more insight. So the overriding message here is Jesus is preparing them, okay? And we'll see as we study out Matthew and then ultimately Mark, Luke, and John that a disproportionate amount of time in the four Gospels, a seemingly disproportionate amount of time, is spent on looking at Jesus' final week of his life and the events leading up to it, because that's the central focus of all human history. Okay, now, I promised you last time we're going to look at a supernatural fishing story, and that starts in the very next verse in Matthew, verse number 24. Let's read. "When they came to Capernaum," you recall that's that town right along the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus' kind of base of operations for a long time, "those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter. And they said, 'Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?' I never noticed this until recently, but their question is posed in a negative sense. They were kind of implying, making this statement that they were assuming, anyways, that Jesus, their teacher, the teacher of Peter, did not pay the 2 drachma tax. What was the 2 drachma tax? It was a tax that all Jews were asked to pay. It was not obligatory, but there obviously were people that went around and collected and so forth and believed that it should be paid. It was paid for the upkeep of the temple. Well, big buildings require upkeep, and especially big religious buildings. And so they're just simply asking Peter, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? And then look what Peter says in reply. I'd never really noticed this. And he said, yes. Well, again, it was a negative question. They didn't say, does your teacher pay the 2 drachma tax? And then Peter said, yes, he does. They said, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? And Peter says, yes. And I assume, am I reading this correctly? Yes, he does not pay it. That's what Peter thought. And I don't know what the basis of that was. If you know this story, you know that Jesus proves Peter to be wrong, if we're understanding it all correctly, the conversation here, because he ultimately does pay that 2 drachma tax. I think as we read these up-and-coming verses, we'll see that Jesus made it clear that he had every excuse to not pay the 2 drachma tax, but he chose to pay it so that people wouldn't be offended by him not paying it. And you can understand, if you're trying to convince people that you are from God, in fact, Jesus was more than from God. He was God. He was the Son of God. For him not to pay the tax that is used for the upkeep of the temple of God, could cause people to stumble and say, well, how could you be from God? How could you be even a prophet if you're not even interested in the upkeep of the temple of God? All right, so it's really interesting how this story progresses, and as Jesus gives instructions as to how Peter's to get the money. You know the story, but I'm going to hopefully show you some details you maybe haven't thought of, so be right back. All right, welcome back. We're in Matthew chapter 17, winding down to the end. We're right in the middle of this neat story of Jesus and his payment and Peter's payment of the 2 drachma tax that was collected for the upkeep of the temple in Jerusalem. Well, this is happening in Capernaum, and the people who asked Peter the question about Jesus, they apparently assumed that Jesus did not pay the 2 drachma tax, and it seems that Peter affirmed that. However, let's break into the middle of the story. Matthew 17 and verse 25, Peter said yes to the guys who asked him the question. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first. And Matthew brings it out. In other words, Jesus did not have a conversation with Peter about what had just transpired so that it was being built upon knowledge that Jesus came naturally, but this is a story based upon knowledge that Jesus had supernaturally. What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers? Verse 26, when Peter said, from strangers, Jesus said to him, then the sons are exempt. And I think you can, see what's going on here. Jesus is implying, because I'm the son of the great king, the king, of the temple, following the pattern of the kings of this world, they don't collect customs or taxes from their sons. They collect them from people who are not related to them, from strangers. And so by every right, I, the Son of God, should not have to pay the temple tax. And so he didn't have to. And I don't know about you, but I'm always looking for reasons not to pay taxes as well. And we have something that Jesus gave us to think about in that. He said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. So we're supposed to be paying our taxes. That's endorsed in the New Testament epistles as well. But that doesn't mean we don't study the tax laws to find every advantage so that we can pay as little of tax as possible. And to render unto Caesar as little as possible, because that gives me more to render unto God. Amen. Okay? So anyway, Jesus is, I think, clearly implying that he's exempt. He said, consequently, or then the sons are exempt. And again, we know he's the Son of God. Verse number 27 begins with the word however. So again, that underscores the fact that he's saying, I'm exempt from this. However, even though I am exempt from this by virtue that I'm the son of the king, so that we do not offend them. Because as Peter walked away, affirming to the two people that asked him the question, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? They may have walked away a bit offended, thinking, well, we pay it, and why doesn't he pay it? He's supposed to be from God. So verse 27 again, however, so that we do not offend them, go to the sea, throw in a hook, take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. I believe a shekel was worth, 4 drachmas, and so that's exactly what was needed to pay 2 people's tax. And so Jesus goes on to say, take that and give it to them for you and me. Now, it's all, condensed into just really one verse. Matthew doesn't go on to tell us of Peter following through on this, although I'm sure that he did follow through on this. And we could take a little liberty. They didn't want to offend the people who asked him about paying the 2 drachma tax. And so it would seem then that those two, in order to not offend them, they'd have to have knowledge that Jesus and Peter did pay the 2 drachma tax. And so I just like to think, and if you'll forgive me for this, that Peter walked out of the house and found those people who had asked him the question, come on with me. I want to show you that Jesus actually does pay this tax. Let me show you how he pays it. And so Peter goes down to the Sea of Galilee. It's just a stone's throw away from where Jesus was staying in Capernaum. And he takes his rod and has a hook on the end of it. And he catches a fish rather quickly. And he pulls it out and he opens its mouth, and wouldn't you know, there's a shekel in there. And Jesus said, take that and give it to them for you and me. Oh, so there it is. Those guys did stay involved who asked him the question, and they were pro-taxpayers. And so Peter gave them that shekel to say, well, I was wrong. Jesus does pay that tax, and I'm paying it as well. And were they there when Peter obtained that shekel? I don't know. Again, Peter didn't have to walk very far. Capernaum's right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee on the western side there. So I like to think that 2 people that day became new disciples of Jesus Christ. In fact, why am I saying it's 2 people? It just says those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter. And so who knows? It could have been a whole group of people that witnessed this incredible miracle. And when I think about all that God had to do, I don't believe, and this is my opinion, I don't believe that God's a counterfeiter. I don't believe that God created a shekel, and created it in the mouth of a fish. I would prefer to believe that fish was swimming along, and at a certain time, when a shekel fell out of someone's hand in a boat or wading out into the water or something, fish are attracted to shiny things. That's fishermen know that. They throw lures that kind of shine in the water, and that's how they catch fish. And so a shekel flip-flopping down through the water, a fish says, oh, there's a little fish, and he grabs it, and he gets it stuck in his mouth. And it just so happens that, that's the fish that Peter catches. And it's even amazing that fish got hooked because he had a shekel also in his mouth. Okay, so just a whole series of circumstances that God had to put in place here in order for this miracle to come to pass, and it came to pass. Okay, all right, so great story. All right, well, we're going to head on now into looking at some of the most immature action you've ever seen by any of Jesus' disciples. It's quite amazing. Be right back. Okay, welcome back. We are now just launching off into Matthew chapter 18. And I really like this whole chapter. There's so much information. It's going to take us a while to get all the way through Matthew 18. But it begins with a very interesting story. Let's just read one verse. Matthew 18, verse number 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, quote, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And they were not asking out of pure academic interest, let me tell you. We know that from other scriptures. As I tried to point out to you, it's so worthwhile to look at the other gospel writers who include the identical stories to see if you can glean some more insight into this. And if we only had Matthew's gospel, we really wouldn't know all that's going on behind the scenes. That's why we had the benefit of Mark and Luke in this case. Okay, so let's take a look at what Mark tells us about this story. This is in verse number 33 of Mark chapter 9. And this is the identical setting. You could research it for yourself, Mount of Transfiguration, the casting out the demon of the epileptic boy and so forth. So it all fits in there. So Mark 9, verse 33, they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he began to question them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. I can hardly believe we're reading this, that they were actually doing this. These grown men who had been with Jesus for almost 3 years now and know that the end is near. Jesus has at least twice told them they're going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer. He's going to be killed there. They're making assumptions that his kingdom is going to, start very soon. And they're questioning, they're debating on one another, who's the greatest among us? Okay, Luke gives us a little insight there, and it's even more interesting, I think, than what either Matthew or Mark tell us. Again, same context, same setting, but this is Luke 9, verse 46. An argument started among them as to which of them might be the greatest. But Jesus, knowing what they were thinking in their heart, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't just a discussion about which one might be the greatest. It wasn't just an academic question. Well, who then is the greatest? No. They all had something personally, a personal agenda. They were hoping to be the greatest. You may remember there's another story in the Gospels of when James and John, and apparently their mother was involved, coming to Jesus requesting that in his kingdom that they would be seated at his right and his left hand. See, they were vying for the positions in what they thought was the soon coming kingdom, this miracle working Messiah whom we know as the Son of God. I mean, he's told us these things about him dying and so forth, but that doesn't make any sense to us. We expect the Messiah, if he's going to Jerusalem, he's going to start his rulership there. And so let's put ourselves in a position to make sure, we stand the most to gain. We read in that same story when James and John requested to be seated at Jesus' right and left hand, that the other disciples resented it. Okay, so, it seems like Jesus' church has never lacked people who are vying for the top slots. And if we look at this honestly, let's just call a spade, people who want to be at the top, and sit at the right and left hand and so forth, and who want to be the greatest, that's nothing more than just pure selfishness, right? Pure self-interest. And boy, I just can't imagine that Jesus wasn't inwardly disappointed in the fact that his key men, the most spiritual people that he has to work with at this point in time, handpicked, by the leading of the Holy Spirit at this point, after observing him and listening to him, are arguing over who's the greatest and wanting positions of authority in his coming kingdom. So he says, I had better make my point. And he makes his point. Let's go back now to Matthew and verse number 18 and verse 2, chapter 18, verse number 2. And he called a child to himself and set him before them. And he said, truly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's not avoiding their question as to who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, but he's leading up to that, because if you're going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, you need to make sure you get into the kingdom of heaven first. That's paramount, all right? Get in, and then we'll worry about any, titles and positions and greatness. So first thing, make sure that you get into heaven, and he calls this child. And he says, you've got to be converted and become like children, or else you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So this is key. This is a salvation verse, isn't it? We need to stop here, pause for a little bit, and think about what Jesus could possibly mean, because he's telling us how to enter God's kingdom. And it has something to do with becoming like children. Well, he doesn't mean that you should become childish, obviously. The other scriptures tell us that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, and the rod will drive it far from him. And Paul admonishes us to, put away childish things. And children are generally, they are self-centered, okay? We know that they're innocent, but still, what are the exact characteristics? What is Jesus trying to say here? I have taught on this numerous times over the years that I've been teaching and so forth. And oftentimes, if I'm teaching at a church and I'm on these verses, I'll just pick a child out from the congregation and pull that child up and say, come on up here. I just want to use you just as Jesus used a child, as an example of a person who's going to heaven. And inevitably, that child always kind of is very timid and shy. It shows a degree of humility. And I think perhaps that's part of what Jesus was saying. We need to humble ourselves. God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Okay? Much more I think Jesus is saying, and we'll get into it next time. Look forward to that. See you